Chapter 102. With a special traveling pass supplied by Massalia, Virgil had hung a lantern on the mule cart and driven it through the night before Thanksgiving in order to get Tom home from the Askew plantation in time for the big dinner. After an absence of 9 months, as the cart rolled back into the Leah driveway in the chilly November afternoon and Virgil quickened the mule to a brisk trot, Tom had to press back tears as the familiar slave row came into view, and he saw all of those whom he had missed so much standing there waiting for him. Then they began waving and shouting, and moments later, grasping his bag of the gifts that he had made with his own hands for each of them, he jumped to the ground amid the huggings and kissings of the womenfolk. Bless his heart, he looks so good, don't he now? See how them shoulders and arms done filled out. Grandmammy, leave me kiss Tom. Don't squeeze him all day. Let me get hold of him too, child. Over their shoulders, Tom caught a glimpse of his 2 younger brothers, James and Louis, wearing odd expressions. He knew that little George was down among the gamecocks with his father, and Virgil had told him that Ashford had gotten the Mass's permission to visit a girl on another plantation. Then he saw the usually bedridden Uncle Pompey sitting outside his cabin in an old cane chair, bundled in a heavy quilt. As soon as he could maneuver clear, Tom hurried over to shake the old man's puffy, trembling hand, bending closer to hear the cracked and almost whispery voice. "Just wants to make sure you's really back to see us, boy. Yassa, Uncle Pompey. Mighty glad to get back." "All right, see you later on," the old man quavered. Tom was having trouble with his emotions. In his now 16 years, not only had he never been treated so much like a man, but also he had never before felt such an outpouring of his slave row family's love and respect. His 2 little sisters were still pulling and clamoring over him when they heard a familiar voice trumpeting in the distance. "Lord, here come Mr. Rooster," exclaimed Matilda, and the women went scurrying to set the Thanksgiving meal on the table. When Chicken George came striding into the slave row area, seeing Tom, he beamed. "Well, look what done got loose and come home." He clapped Tom heavily across the shoulders with his hand. "Is you making any money yet?" "Naw, sir, not yet, Pappy." "What kind of blacksmith you is ain't making no money?" demanded George in mock astonishment. Tom remembered that he had always felt caught in a windstorm whenever closely exposed to his father's bombastic way of expressing himself. "Long ways yet from bein' no blacksmith, Pappy. Just trying to learn," he said. "Well, you tell that Isaiah I say, hurry up and learn you somepin." "Yassa," said Tom mechanically, his mind flashing that he could probably never master even so much as half of what Mr. Isaiah was patiently making every effort to help him learn. He asked, "Ain't little George comin' up here for dinner?" "He might get here in time, and he might not," said Chicken George. "He too lazy to finish what I give him to do first thing this mornin'. And I told him I don't want to see his face up here till he get it done." Chicken George was moving over to Uncle Pompey. "Sho glad to see you out in yo' cabin, Uncle Pompey. How's you doin'?" "Po'ly, son, mighty po'ly. Old man just ain't no mo' good, that's all." "Don't give me that stuff, nary bit," boomed Chicken George, and laughing he turned to Tom. "Yo' ol' Uncle Pompey one dem ol' lizard kind o' gonna live to be 100. Done got real low sick reckon 2-3 times since you been gone, but every time de women folks all snifflin' ready to bury him, he get right back up again." The 3 of them were laughing when the voice of Grandmammy Kizzy shrilled at them, "Y'all bring Pompey on over here to the table now." Though the day was crisp, the women had set up a long table under the chinkapin tree so that everybody could enjoy their Thanksgiving dinner together. James and Louis seized Uncle Pompey's chair, with Sister Sarah running up solicitously behind them. "Don't drop him now. He still ain't too old to fan y'all's britches," called Chicken George. When they were all seated, though Chicken George was at the head of the table, it was pointedly to Tom that Matilda said, "Son, grace the table." The startled Tom wished he had anticipated this, to have given advance thought to some prayer that would express the emotions he was feeling about the warmth and strength of a family. But with everyone's head already bowed, all he could think of now was, "O Lord, bless this food we's about to eat. We ax in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen." "Amen, amen," others echoed up and down the table. Then Matilda, Grandmammy Kizzy, and Sister Sarah began shuttling back and forth, setting heaped and steaming bowls and platters at intervals along the table, and urging all to help themselves, before they also finally sat back down. For several minutes not a word was spoken as everyone ate as if they were starving, with appreciative grunts and smacking noises. Then, after a while, with either Matilda or Kizzy refilling his glass with fresh buttermilk or putting more hot meat, vegetables, and cornbread on his plate, they began plying Tom with questions. "Po thing, is they feedin' you any good over yonder? Who cook fo you, anyhow?" asked Matilda. Tom chewed his mouth full enough to reply. "Mr. Isaiah's wife, Miss Emma." "What color she is? What she look like?" asked Kizzy. "She black, sort of fat." "Dat ain't got nothin' to do with her cooking," guffawed Chicken George. "She cook any good, boy?" "Pretty fair, pappy, yassa." Tom nodded affirmatively. "Well, ain't like yo' own mammies nohow," snapped Sister Sarah. Tom murmured agreeably, "No'm," thinking how indignant Miss Emma would have been to hear them, and how indignant they'd be to know that she was a better cook. "Her and dat blacksmith man, is they good Christian folks?" "Yes'm, they is," he said. "'Specially Miss Emma. She read the Bible a whole lots." Tom was just finishing his third plateful when his mammy and grandmammy descended on him with still more, despite his vigorous head-shaking. He managed a muffled protest. "Save somethin' for little George when he come." "Plenty left for him, and you knows it," said Matilda. "Have another piece of dis fried rabbit, little Modie's collard greens, and dis stewed winter squash. And Melizzy done sent down a great big sweet tater custard from de dinner she servin' in de big house. Y'all knows how good dat is." Tom had started forking into the custard when Uncle Pompey cleared his throat to speak, and everyone hushed up to hear him. "Boy, is you shoein' mules and hosses yet?" "They lets me pull off the ole shoes, but I ain't put none on yet," said Tom, thinking how only the previous day it had been necessary to hobble a vicious mule before it could be shod. Loudly Chicken George hooted. "Spec he ain't got 'nuff good hard mule kicks yet to be broken good. Mighty easy to mess up hosses' foots less'n somebody know what he doin'. Heerd 'bout one blacksmith put de shoes on backwards, and dat hoss wouldn't do nothin' but back up." When he quit laughing at his own joke, Chicken George asked, "How much y'all get for shoein' hosses and mules?" "B'lieves de mens pays Massa Askew 14 cents a shoe," said Tom. "Sho ain't no money in it like fightin' chickens," Chicken George exclaimed. "Well, it's sho plenty mo' use o' blacksmithin' than it is them chickens," snapped Grandmammy Kizzy, her tone so cutting that Tom wanted to jump up and hug her. Then she went on, her voice suddenly tender. "Son, what de man have you doin' in learnin' you how to blacksmith?" Tom was glad she asked, for he wanted to share with his family some idea of what he was doing. "Well, Grandmammy, early every mornin' I has to forge fire goin' good by time Mr. Isaiah gets here. Den I lays out de tools I knows he gonna need for de jobs he gonna be doin'. 'Cause when you shapin' red-hot iron, can't let it be coolin' down while you hunts for de right hammers to hit it wid." "Lawd, de child blacksmithin' already!" exclaimed Sister Sarah. "No'm," said Tom. "I be's what dey calls a striker. If Mr. Isaiah makin' somethin' heavy, like wagon axles or plowshares, den I hits wid de sledge wherever he tap his hammer, and sometime little simple jobs he'll let me finish while he starts somethin' else." "When he gonna let you start shoein' de hosses?" asked Chicken George, still pushing, seeming almost as if he wanted to embarrass his blacksmithing son, but Tom grinned. "Dunno, pappy, but I reckon soon's he feel like I can do it widout his help. Just like you said, I sho has got kicked a plenty times. Fact, some dem bad ones get to rarin' up, dey won't only kick. They'll bite a plug out'n you if you ain't careful." "Do white folks come round at blacksmith shop, son?" asked Sister Sarah. "Yes, ma'am, whole lots of 'em. Ain't hardly no day don't see least a dozen or mo' standin' round talkin' while dey's waitin' for Mr. Isaiah to finish whatever work dey done brung." "Well, den what kind o' news is you done heerd 'em talkin' about dat maybe we ain't, bein' stuck off like we is here?" Tom thought a moment, trying to remember what had Mr. Isaiah and Miss Emma felt were the most important things they'd recently heard white people talking about. Well, one thing was somethin' dey calls telegraph. It was some Massa Morse in Washington, D.C., dat talked to somebody clear in Baltimore. Dey say he say, "What have God wrought?" but I ain't never got straight of what it's supposed to mean. Every head around the dinner table turned toward Matilda as their Bible expert, but she seemed perplexed. I can't be sho," she said uncertainly, "but believe I ain't never read nothin' 'bout dat in de Bible." "Somehow or another, mammy," said Tom, "seemed like it weren't to do with the Bible. It was just somethin' talked a long ways through the air." He asked then if any of them were aware that a few months before President Polk had died of diarrhea in Nashville, Tennessee, and had been succeeded by President Zachary Taylor. "Everybody know dat!" exclaimed Chicken George. "Well, you know so much you ain't never told it in my hearin'," said Sister Sarah sharply. Tom said, "White folks, 'specially dey young'uns, is been comin' round singing songs s'posed to sound like us, but dey was writ by a Massa Stephen Foster." Tom sang the little that he could remember of Old Black Joe, "My Old Kentucky Home," and "Massa's in de cold ground." "Sho do sound somethin' like," Grandmammy Kizzy exclaimed. "Mr. Isaiah say dat Massa Foster growed up spendin' a lot of time listenin' to singin' in churches and round to steamboats and wharves," said Tom. "Dat 'splain it," said Matilda. "But ain't you heerd of no doin's by none of us?" "Well, yassum," said Tom. And he said that free blacks who brought work to Mr. Isaiah had been talking a lot about famous northern blacks who were fighting against slavery, traveling around, lecturing large mixed audiences to tears and cheers by telling their life stories as slaves before they had escaped to freedom. "Like it's one named Frederick Douglass," Tom said. "Dey says he was raised a slave boy in Maryland, and he teached hisself to read and write and finally worked and saved up enough to buy hisself free from his massa." Matilda cast a meaningful glance at Chicken George as Tom went on. "Dey says people gathers by de hunnets anywhere he speak, and he done writ a book and even started up a newspaper." "It's famous women's too, mammy." Tom looked at Matilda, Grandmammy Kizzy, and Sister Sarah, and he told them of a former slave named Sojourner Truth, said to be over 6 feet tall, who also lectured before huge crowds of white and black people, though she could neither read nor write. Springing up from her seat, Grandmammy Kizzy began wildly gesturing. "Sees right now I needs to get up north and do me some talking." She mimicked as if she were facing a big audience. "Y'all white folks listen here to Kizzy. Ain't gonna have dis mess no mo'. Us sick and tired of slavin'. Mammy, de boy say dat women's 6 feet. You ain't tall enough," Chicken George said, roaring with laughter as the others around the table glared at him in mock indignation. Chagrined, Grandmammy Kizzy sat back down. Tom told them of another famous escaped slave woman. She named Harriet Tubman. Ain't no tellin' how many times she come back south and led out different whole bunches of folks like us to freedom up north, and somethin' dey's call the Underground Railroad. Fac', she done it so much dey claims by now white folks got out $40,000 worth of rewards for her, alive or dead. Lord have mercy, wouldn't ha' thought white folks pay dat much to catch no in de world," said Sister Sarah. He told them that in a far distant state called California, 2 white men were said to have been building a sawmill when they discovered an unbelievable wealth of gold in the ground, and thousands of people were said to be rushing in wagons, on mules, even afoot, to reach the place where it was claimed that gold could be dug up by the shovelful. He said finally that in the north, Great debates on the subject of slavery were being held between two white men named Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln. "Which one of 'em for the asked Grandmammy Kizzy. "Well, sound like the Massa Lincoln, leastways the best I can tell," said Tom. "Well, praise the Lord and give him strength," said Kizzy. Sucking his teeth, Chicken George got up, patting his ample belly, and turning to Tom. "Look-a-here, boy, why'n't you and me stretch our legs, walk off some of dat meal?" "Yassa, Pappy," Tom almost stammered, scarcely able to conceal his amazement and trying to act casual. The women, who were no less startled, exchanged quizzical, significant glances when Chicken George and Tom set off together down the road. Sister Sarah exclaimed softly, "Lawd, y'all realize that boy done growed nigh big as his daddy." James and Louis stared after their father and older brother, nearly sick with envy, but they knew better than to invite themselves along. But the two younger girls, Lil Kizzy and Mary, couldn't resist leaping up and happily starting to hop-skip along 8 or 10 steps behind them. Without even looking back at them, Chicken George ordered, "Get on back yonder and help y'all's mammy with them dishes." "Aw, Pappy," they whined in unison. "Git, done tole you." Half turning around with his eyes loving his little sisters, Tom chided them gently. "Ain't y'all hear Pappy? We see you later on." With the girls' complaining sounds behind them, they walked on in silence for a little way, and Chicken George spoke almost gruffly. "Look-a-here, reckon you know I ain't mean no harm just teasing you a little at dinner." "Ah, nah, sir," Tom said, privately astounded at what amounted to an apology from his father. "I knowed you was just teasing." Grunting, Chicken George said, "What say we head on down and look in on dem chickens, see what keepin' dat no-count Lil George down dere so long. All I knows, he might a cooked and et up some of dem chickens fo' his Thanksgivin' by now." Tom laughed. "Lil George mean well, Pappy. He just a little slow. He done tole me he just done love them birds like you does." Tom paused, then decided to venture his accompanying thought. "I spec nobody in de world loves dem birds like you does." But Chicken George agreed readily enough. "Nobody in dis family, anyways. I done tried 'em all, 'ceptin' you. Seem like all de rest my boys willin' to spend dey lives draggin' from one end of a field to de other, lookin' up a mule's butt." He considered for a moment. "Yo blacksmithin' wouldn't 'zactly call no high livin' neither, nothin' like gamecockin', but leastways it's a man's work." Tom wondered if his father ever seriously respected anything excepting fighting chickens. He felt deeply grateful that somehow he had escaped into the solid, stable trade of blacksmithing. But he expressed his thoughts in an oblique way. "Don't see nothin' wrong with farming, Pappy. If some folks wasn't farmin', spec nobody would be eatin'. I just took to blacksmithin' same as you would gamecockin', 'cause I loves it, and the Lord gimme a knack fo' it. Just everybody don't love the same things." "Well, least you and me got sense to make money doin' what we likes," said Chicken George. Tom replied, "You does, anyway. I won't make no money fo' a couple mo' years, till I's finished 'prenticin' and goes to work for Massa, dat is, if he gimme some de money, like he do a what you wins tax fightin'." "Sho he will," said Chicken George. "Massa ain't bad as yo' mammy and grandmammy and dem likes to claim. He got his ornery ways, sho is. You just have to learn how to get to Massa's good side, like I does. Keep him believin' you considers him one dem high-class Massas what do good by day." Chicken George paused. "Dat Massa ask you whose place you over there workin' on. You got any idea what 'mount of money he give dat Isaiah fo' his blacksmithin'?" "I believes $1 a week," said Tom. "I's heard Mr. Isaiah's wife say dat's what he give her every week to save, and she do, every penny." "Less'n a minute win more'n dat fightin' chickens," Chicken George exclaimed, and then contained himself. "Well, anyhow, you just leave de money part to me when you comes back here to blacksmith fo' Massa. I talk to him good 'bout how cheap dat Massa Askew is with his." "Yassa." Chicken George was experiencing a peculiar feeling that he really wished to ensure having the alliance, even the approval of this particular one among his 6 sons. Not that anything was wrong with the other 5, and despite the fact that this one was by far the least likely ever to sport anything like a green scarf and black derby with a long feather in it, it was just that very clearly this Tom possessed qualities of responsibleness not encountered every day, as well as an unusual individual durability and strength. They had walked on in silence for a while when Chicken George said abruptly, "You ever think about blacksmithin' for yourself, boy?" "What do you mean? How in the world I gonna do dat, Pappy?" "You ever think about saving the money you gonna be making and buying yourself free?" Seeing Tom too thunderstruck to reply, Chicken George kept talking. "Few years back round when lil' Kizzy born, one night me and yo' mammy set down and figured 'bout how much it cost to buy us whole family free, 'cordin' to prices fo' dem days. Comed around $6,800. Woo! Tom was shaking his head. "Hear me out," George said. "Sho, it's a lot. But ever since den, I been hack fightin' my butt off, wid yo' mammy savin' my share of de winnin's. Ain't winned as much as I'd figured when I started out, but all de same don't nobody know but yo' mammy and me, and now you. She got mo'n $1,000 buried in jars around de backyard." Chicken George looked at Tom. "Boy, I's just thinkin'." "Me too, Pappy." A gleam was in Tom's eyes. "Listen here, boy." The urgency increased in Chicken George's tone. "If an I keeps winnin' 'bout de same as in de past few seasons, I oughta have 300–400 mo' stashed away time you starts blacksmithin' for massa." Tom was eagerly nodding his head. "And Pappy, wid both us makin' money, Mammy could bury maybe 500–600 a year," he said excitedly. "Yeah," Chicken George exclaimed. "And dat rate, lessen prices is rise a lot higher. We ought to have 'nuff to buy us whole family free inside lemme see now." They both figured, using their fingers. After a while, Tom exclaimed, "'Bout 15 years." "Where you learn to count so fast? What you think about my idea, boy?" "Pappy, gonna blacksmith my head off. I just wish you'd have said something fo' now." "Wid 2 us, I knows we can do it," said George, beaming. "Make this family mount to somepin'. Us all get up now, raisin' chilluns and grandchilluns free, like folks was meant to. What you say, boy?" Both deeply moved, Tom and Chicken George had impulsively grasped each other about the shoulders, when just then they turned to see the stout, pudgy figure of Lil George approaching at a lumbering trot, shouting, "Tom! Tom!" and wearing a grin seeming almost as wide as himself. Reaching them breathless, his chest heaving, he grabbed and pumped Tom's hands, clapped him on the back, and stood there alternately wheezing and grinning, with sweat making his plump cheeks shine. "Glad to see you, Tom," he gasped finally. "Take it easy there, boy," said Chicken George. "You won't have strength to get to yo' dinner." "Never too tired for dat, Pappy." "Whyn't you get on up there and eat den," said Tom, "and we join you by and by. Pappy and me got things to talk about." "All right, I see y'all later," said Lil George, needing no further encouragement as he turned to head for Slave Row. "Better hurry," Chicken George shouted after him. "Don't know how long yo' mammy can hold off yo' brothers from eating up what's left." Watching Lil George break into a waddling run, Tom and his father stood holding their sides from laughter until he disappeared around the bend, still gaining momentum. "We better figure 16 years 'fore we gets free," Chicken George gasped. "How come?" asked Tom, quickly concerned. "Way dat boy eat. Gonna cost a year's pay just keeping him fed till den." Chapter 103. In the memory of Chicken George, nothing had ever generated such excitement among North Carolina gamecockers as the news that spread swiftly during late November of 1855 that the wealthy Massachusetts was entertaining as his house guest a titled, equally rich gamecocker from England who had brought with him across the ocean 30 of his purebred Old English game birds. said to be the finest breed of fighting cocks in existence. According to the news, the Englishman Sir C. Eric Russell had accepted Massachusetts' written invitation to pit his birds against some of the best in the United States, since as longtime friends, they preferred not to fight their gamecocks against one another. Each of them would supply 20 birds to fight any 40 challenger birds whose collective owners would be expected to ante up their half of $1,000 main pot, and 250 side bets would be the minimum permitted on each cockfight. Another wealthy local gamecocker volunteered to organize the 40 competitors, accepting only 5 birds apiece from 7 other owners besides himself. It had not been really necessary for Massalia to tell his veteran trainer that he was going after a share of such a huge pot. "Well," he said upon return to the plantation after posting his $1,875 bond, "we've got 6 weeks to train 5 birds." "Yassa, ought to be able to do dat, I reckon," Chicken George replied, trying as hard, and as unsuccessfully, not to seem excited. Apart from his own deep thrill just to think of such a contest, Chicken George exulted to the assembled Slave Row family that it seemed to him that sheer excitement had rolled 25 years off Massalia. "Dey show pricin' out any hag fighters," he exclaimed. "Massa say it's show de biggest money fight he ever got anywheres near to. Fac, de second biggest he ever even heard of." "Phew! What bigger fight was dat?" exclaimed Uncle Pompey. Chicken George said, "Reckon maybe 20 years back, dis double rich Massa Nicholas Arrington, what lived near Nashville, Tennessee, took Lebanon-covered wagons, 22 men's, and 300 birds clear crossed no tellin' how many states, through bandits and Indians and everything, till they got to Mexico. They fought against another 300 birds belonging to the President o' Mexico, a General Santa Anna, what had so much money he couldn't even count it, and swo he raised the world's greatest gamecocks. Well, Massa say the fightin' just them 2 men's birds went on a solid week. The stake was so big, dey main purse was a chest apiece full of money. Massa say even dey side bets coulda broke most rich men's. In the end, this Tennessee Massa Arrington won round $500,000. His birds he called Cripple Tonys after his crippled trainer named Tony, and that Mexican General Santa Anna wanted one dem Cripple Tonys so bad for a breeding cock he paid its weight in gold. "I see right now I better get into chicken business," said Uncle Pompey. For most of the next 6 weeks, Chicken George and Massalia were seldom seen by anyone else on the plantation. "It's a good thing Massa keepin' off down there with dem chickens, mad as ol' Missus is," Miss Melizzy told the others on Slave Row at the end of the 3rd week. "I heard her just screechin' at him 'bout takin' $5,000 out in de bank. Heard her say it near 'bout half what dey got saved up from all dey lives, and she just hollered and carried on 'bout him tryin' to keep up with dem real rich Massas what got 1,000 times mo' money than he is." After shouting at the missus to shut up and mind her own damn business, the Massa stalked out of the house, said Miss Melizzy. Listening grimly, but saying nothing, were Matilda and 22-year-old Tom, who 4 years before had returned to the plantation and built a blacksmith shop behind the barn, where by now he was serving a thriving trade of customers for Massalia. Fit to burst with anger, Matilda had confided to her son how Chicken George had furiously demanded and gotten their own $2,000 cash of savings, which he was going to turn over to the Massa to be bet on the Leah birds. Matilda, too, had screeched and wept in desperate effort to reason with Chicken George. "But he act like he gone crazy," she had told Tom. "Hollered at me, 'Woman, I knows every bird we got from when they was eggs. 3 or 4 ain't nothin' with wings can beat. Ain't 'bout to pass up this chance to 'zactly double what we got saved no quicker'n it take one our chickens to kill another'n. 2 minutes can save us 8, 9 mo' years o' scrapin' and savin' to buy us free. Mammy, I know you told Pappy to save and have to start over again if the chickens lose," Tom had exclaimed. "Ain't only told him dat. Tried my best to press on him, he ain't got no right to gamble with our freedom. But he got real mad, hollerin', ain't no way we can lose. You gimme my money, woman. And Matilda had done so. She had told Tom, her face stricken. In the game fowl area, Chicken George and Massalia finished culling 17 of the best range walk birds down to 10 of the finest gamecocks either of them had ever seen. Then they began air training those 10 birds, tossing them higher and higher, until finally 8 of them flew as much as a dozen yards before their feet touched the ground. "I 'clare look like we's trainin' wild turkeys, massa," chortled Chicken George. "They're going to need to be hawks up against Jewetts and that Englishman's birds," said the massa. When the great cockfight was but a week away, the massa rode off, and late the following day he returned with 6 pairs of the finest obtainable Swedish steel gaffs, their lengths as sharp as razors, tapering to needle points. After a final critical appraisal 2 days before the fight, each of the 8 birds seemed so perfect that there was simply no way to say which 5 were best. So the massa decided to take all 8 and choose among them at the last minute. He told Chicken George that they would leave the following midnight in order to arrive early enough for both the gamecocks and themselves to rest from the long ride and be fresh for the big fights. Chicken George knew that the massa was itching as bad as he was just to get there. The long ride through the darkness was uneventful. As he drove, his gaze idly upon the lantern glowing and bobbing at the end of the wagon's tongue between the 2 mules. Chicken George thought with mingled feelings of his and Matilda's recent emotional altercation about the money. He told himself resentfully that he knew better than she did how many years of patient saving it represented. After all, hadn't it been his own perennial scores upon scores of hack fights that had earned it? He'd never feel for a moment that Matilda wasn't as good as wives came, so he regretted he'd had to shut her down, upsetting her so badly, as apparently the massa had also been forced to do within the big house. But on the other hand, there were those times when the head of the family simply had to make the important, hard decisions. He again heard Matilda's tearful cry, "George, you ain't got no right to gamble with all our freedom." How quickly she'd forgotten that it had been he in the first place who had introduced the idea of accumulating enough to buy their freedom. And after all those slow years of saving, it was now nothing but a godsend that the massa had confided that he needed more cash for side betting during the forthcoming fights, not only to make a good showing before those snobby rich massas, but to win their money as well. Chicken George grinned to himself, remembering with relish Massalia's utterly astounded expression at hearing him say, "I got about $2,000 saved that you can use to bet with, massa." Upon recovering from his shock, Massalia had actually grabbed and shook his trainer's hand, pledging his word that Chicken George would receive every cent that was won in bets using his money, declaring, "You ought to double it anyhow." The massa hesitated. "Boy, what you gonna do with $4,000? In that instant, Chicken George had decided to take an even bigger gamble, to reveal why he had been saving so long and so hard. "Massa, don't mistake me none. Ain't got nothin' but the best kind of feelin's 'bout you, massa, but me and Tilda just got to talkin', and massa we just 'cided we gonna try see couldn't us buy us and our chillin's from you, and spend out the rest our days free." Seeing Massalia clearly taken aback, Chicken George again implored, "Please, Lord, don't take us wrong, massa." But then, in one of Chicken George's most richly warming life experiences, Massalia had said, "Boy, I'm gonna tell you what's been on my mind about this chicken fight we're going into. I'm figuring for it to be my last big one. Don't think you even realize, I'm 78 years old. I've been over 50 years of dragging back and forth every season, worrying with raising and fighting these chickens. I'm sick of it, you hear me? I tell you what, boy, with my cut of that main pot and side bets, I'm figuring to win enough to build me and my wife another house. Not no great big mansion like I wanted one time, but just 5-6 rooms, new. That's all we need. And I hadn't thought about it until you just brought it up. But then won't be no more point in owning a whole passel of y'all to have to fend for. Just Sarah and Melizzy could cook and keep a good garden we can live off, and have enough money in the bank not to never have to beg nobody for nothin'. Chicken George was barely breathing as Massalia went on. So I'm going to tell you what, boy. Y'all have served me well, and ain't never give me no real trouble. We win this chicken fight big, at least double both our money. Yeah, you just give me what you'll have, $4,000, and we'll call it square. And you know good as I do, all y'all are worth twice that. Fact, I never told you, but once that rich Jewett offered me $4,000 just for you, and I turned him down. Yeah, and y'all can go on free if that's what you want. Suddenly in tears, Chicken George had lunged to embrace Massalia, who quickly moved aside in embarrassment. Oh, Lawdy, Massa, you don't know what you sayin'. Us wants to be free so bad. Massalia's reply was strangely hoarse. Well, I don't know what y'all will do, free, without somebody looking out for you. And I know my wife's going to raise all manners of hell about me just the same as giving y'all away. That blacksmith boy Tom alone is worth a good $2,500, plus he's making me good money to boot. Roughly, the massa had shoved Chicken George. Get before I change my mind. Hell, I must be crazy, but I hope your woman and Mammy and the rest of y'all find out I ain't bad as I know they always make me out to be. Ah, Nasa, Massa, thank you, Massa. Chicken George went scrambling backward as Massalia hastily departed up the road toward the big house. Chicken George wished now more than ever that the bitter encounter with Matilda had never occurred. Now he decided it best to keep his triumphant secret, to let Matilda, his Mammy Kizzy, and the whole family learn of their freedom as an absolutely total surprise. Still, fit to burst with such a secret, several times he nearly told Tom, but then always at the last moment he didn't. For even as solid a man as Tom was, he was so close with both his Mammy and Grandmammy that he might swear them to secrecy, which would ruin it. Also, that would activate among them the very sticky issue that, according to what the massa had said, Sister Sarah, Miss Melizzy, and Uncle Pompey were going to have to be left behind, though they were as much family as anybody else. So across the interim weeks, Chicken George, pent up with his secret, had submerged himself body and soul into honing into absolute perfection the final 8 gamecocks that now were riding quietly in their coops behind him, and Massalia in the big custom-built wagon rolling along the lonely road through the dark. At intervals, Chicken George wondered what the uncommonly silent Massalia was thinking. It was in the early daylight when they caught sight of the vast and motley throng that even this early had not only overrun the cockfighting area, but had also spilled into an adjoining pasture that was quickly filling with other wagons, carriages, buggies, carts, and snorting mules and horses. "Tom Leah!" a group of poor crackers cried out upon seeing the massa climb down from his huge wagon. "Go get 'em, Tom!" As he adjusted his black derby, Chicken George saw the massa nodding at them in a friendly manner, but he kept on walking. He knew that the massa wavered between pride and embarrassment at his notoriety among the crackers. After half a century as a gamecocker, in fact, Massalia was a legend wherever chickens were fought locally, since even at his age of 78, his ability to handle birds in a cockpit seemed undiminished. Chicken George had never heard such a din of crowing gamecocks as he began unpacking things for action. A passing slave trainer stopped and told him that among the crowd were many who had traveled for days from other states, even as distant as Florida. Glancing about as they talked, Chicken George saw that the usual spectator area was more than doubled, but already was crawling with men guaranteeing themselves a seat. Among those moving steadily past the wagon, he saw as many strange faces, both white and black, as he did familiar ones, and he felt pride when numerous among both races obviously recognized him, usually nudging their companions and whispering. The sprawling crowd's buzzing excitement rose to a yet higher pitch when 3 judges came to the cockpit and began measuring and marking the starting lines. Another buzz arose when someone's gamecock fluttered loose and went furiously attacking men in its path, even sending a dog yelping, until the bird was cornered and caught. And the crowd's noises swelled with each arrival and identification of any of the area's well-known gamecockers, especially the rest of the 8 who would be competing against the sponsoring masses Jewett and Russell. "I ain't never seed no Englishman, is you?" Chicken George overheard one poor white man ask another, who said he hadn't either. He also heard talk about the titled Englishman's wealth, that he had not only a huge English estate, but also rich holdings in places called Scotland, Ireland, and Jamaica. And he heard that Massa Jewett had proudly boasted among friends of how his guest was known for fighting his birds any time, anywhere, against any competition, for any amount. Chicken George was chopping a few apples into small bits to feed the birds when suddenly the crowd noise rose to a roar, and standing up quickly in the wagon he recognized the approaching canopied surrey, driven by Massa Jewett's always poker-faced black coachman. In the back were the 2 rich masses, smiling and waving down at the crowd, surging so thickly around them that the carriage's finely matched horses had a hard time progressing. And not far behind came 6 wagons, each filled with tall cock coops, the lead wagon driven by Massa Jewett's white trainer, alongside of whom sat a thin and keen-nosed white man whom Chicken George overheard someone nearly exclaim that the titled, wealthy Englishman had brought clear across the ocean just to care for his birds. But the oddly dressed, short, stockily built, and ruddy-complexioned English nobleman himself was the milling crowd's major focus of attention as he rode alongside Massa Jewett in the surrey. Both of them looking every inch the important, even lordly men they were, the Englishman seeming to display just an extra touch of disdain and hauteur toward the jostling throng on the ground. Chicken George had attended so many cockfights that he turned to his work of massaging the legs and wings of his birds, knowing out of experience that different sounds of the crowd would tell him whatever was going on, without his even looking. Soon a referee shouted for a quieting of the hoots, catcalls, and rebel yells that said that many in the crowd had already been hard at their bottles. Then he heard the first announcement. Mr. Fred Rudolph of Williamstown is pitting his red bird against Sir C. Eric Russell of England with his speckled grey. Then, bill your cocks, and then, pit! And the crowd's shouting, followed by a sudden odd hush, told him as clearly as he had been watching that the fight had quickly been won by the Englishman's bird. As each of the 8 challengers in turn fought their string of 5 birds alternately against one belonging either to Massa Jewett or the Englishman, Chicken George had never heard such a roar of side betting in his life, and the battles within the pit were often matched by the verbal contests between the crowd and the referees shouting for quiet. Now and then the crowd noises would tell the busy Chicken George that both birds had been hurt badly enough for the referees to stop the fight to let the owners doctor them up before the fight continued. George could tell from a special roaring of the crowd each time one of the wealthy men's birds was beaten, which wasn't often, and he wondered nervously how soon Massalia's turn was going to come. George guessed that the judges must be picking the order of challengers by plucking their names on slips from a hat. He would have loved to see at least some of the actual fighting, but so much was at stake. He was not going to interrupt his massaging, not even for one moment. He thought fleetingly about what a fortune of money, some of it his own years of savings, the Massa was only waiting to bet on the very birds whose muscles he was gently kneading under his fingers. Although only some chosen 5 among them would fight, there was no way to guess which 5, so every one of the 8 had to be in the very ultimate of physical readiness and condition. Chicken George had not often prayed in his life, but now he did so. He tried to picture what Matilda's face was going to look like, First, when he returned and dropped into her apron their money at least doubled, and next when he would ask her to assemble the whole family, when he would announce they would be free. Then he heard the shout of the referee. The next 5 challenging birds are owned and will be handled by Mr. Tom Leah of Caswell County. George's heart leaped up into his throat. Clapping his derby tighter on his head, he sprang down from the wagon, knowing the massa would be coming now to select his first bird. Tom Leah! Above the crowd noise he heard the name being squalled out by the poor crackers. Then came advancing raucous rebel yells as a group of men surged out of the crowd, surrounding the massa. Reaching the wagon amid them, he cupped his hand over his mouth and over the din shouted in George's ear, "These fellows will help us take 'em over by the cockpit. Yassa, massa." George went leaping back onto the wagon, handling down the 8 cock coops to the massa's poor white companions, his thoughts flashing that in his 37 years of game-cocking he never had ceased to marvel at Massa Leah's appearance of a totally detached calm in such tense times as now. Then they were all trooping back toward the cockpit through the crowd, Massa Leah carrying the splendid dark buff bird he had chosen to fight first, and Chicken George bringing up the rear carrying his woven basket of emergency injury medications, rabbit underbelly fur, some leaves of fresh ivy, glycerin, a ball of spider's web, and turpentine. It was a worsening push-and-shove progress the closer they got toward the cockpit, with the alcoholic cries of "Tom Leah" ringing in their ears, as well as sometimes, "That's his Chicken George." And George could feel the eyes on him as if they were fingers, and it felt good, but kept both moving and looking straight ahead, trying to appear as cool as the massa. And then Chicken George saw the short, squat, titled Englishman standing casually near the cockpit, holding a magnificent bird within the crook of his left arm, as his eyes watchfully appraised the little procession of them arriving with the challenger birds. After exchanging curt nods with Massa Leah, Russell set his bird on the scales, and the referee sang out, 5 pounds and 15 ounces. The beautiful bird's silvery blue plumage reflected brilliantly in the sunlight. Then the massa stepped up with his dark buff bird, which was one of Chicken George's particular favorites. It was powerful, savage, its neck jerking about like a rattlesnake, murder in its eyes, and it was seething to be released. When the referee shouted, 6 pounds even, the hard-drinking poor white fans started yelling as if the extra ounce meant the fight was won already. "Tom Leah! Go get that Britisher, Tom! Act like he mighty stuck up! Take him down a peg!" It was plain that Massa Leah's special fans were really well liquored, and Chicken George saw the darkening flush of embarrassment on both the Massa's and the Englishmen's faces as, pretending not to hear, they kneeled to tie on their birds' steel gaffs. But the cries grew more loud and rude. "Them chickens are ducks he fightin'. Nah, it's swimmin' chickens. Yeah, he feed 'em fishes." The Englishman's face was angry. The referee had begun dashing back and forth, furiously waving his arms, shouting, "Gentlemen, please!" But the derisive laughter only spread, and the wise cracks became more cutting. "Where's his red coat at? Do he fight foxes too? Nah, too slow, waddle like a possum. More like a bullfrog. He looked to me like a bloodhound." Massa Jewett strode out, angrily confronting the referee, his hands hacking the air, but with his words drowned out by the chanting chorus, "Tom Leah! Tom Leah!" Now even the judges joined the referee, dashing this way and that, flailing their arms, brandishing their fists, and barking repeatedly, "The cockfight will stop unless there's quiet. Y'all want that, keep it up." Slowly, the drunken cries and laughter began subsiding. Chicken George saw Massa Leah's face sick with his embarrassment, and that both the Englishman and Massa Jewett were absolutely livid. "Mr. Leah!" When the Englishman loudly and abruptly snapped out the words, almost instantly the crowd fell silent. "Mr. Leah, we both have such superb birds here. I wonder if you'd care to join me in a special personal side bet." Chicken George knew that every man among the hundreds present sensed, just as he did, the Englishman's tone of vengefulness and condescension behind his manner of civility. The back of the mass's neck, he saw, had suddenly become flushed with his anger. A few seconds brought Massalia's stiff reply. "That will suit me, sir. What is your proposition?" The Englishman paused. He appeared to be pondering the matter before he spoke. Would $10,000 be sufficient? He let the wave of gasps sweep the crowd, and then, that is, unless you haven't that much faith in your bird's chances, Mr. Leah, he stood looking at the massa, his thin smile clearly contemptuous. The crowd's brief exclamatory rumbling quickly faded into a deathly stillness. Those who had been seated were standing up now. Chicken George's heart seemed to have stopped beating. Like a distant echo, he heard Miss Melissie's report of Mrs. Leah's fury that the $5,000 the massa had withdrawn from the bank was near about half-day life savings. So Chicken George knew Massa Leah couldn't dare to call that bet. But what possible response could he make not to be utterly humiliated before this throng, including practically everyone he knew? Sharing his mass's agony, Chicken George couldn't even bring himself to look at him. An eternity seemed to pass. Then George doubted his ears. Massa Leah's voice was strained. "Sir, would you care to double that? 20,000. The whole crowd vented exclamations of incredulity amid rustling, agitated movements. In sheer horror, Chicken George realized that sum represented Massa Leah's total assets in the world, his home, his land, his slaves, plus Chicken George's savings. He saw the Englishman's expression of utter astonishment before quickly he collected himself, his face now set and grim. "A true sportsman," he exclaimed, extending his hand to Massa Leah. "A bet, sir. Let us heal up our birds." Suddenly then Chicken George understood. Massa Leah knew that his magnificent dark buff bird would win. Not only would the massa become instantly rich, but this one crucial victory would make him forever a heroic legend for all poor crackers, a symbol that even the snobbish, rich blue blood masses could be challenged and beaten. None of them could ever again look down their noses at Tom Leah. Massa Leah and the Englishman now bent down on their opposite sides of the cockpit, and in that instant it seemed to Chicken George that the entire life of the massa's bird flashed through his mind. Even as a cockerel, its unbelievably quick reflexes at first had caught his attention. Then as a stag, its amazing viciousness saw it constantly trying to attack others through the cracks in their fence-row pen, and when recently retrieved from the range-walk, within seconds, it had nearly killed the old catchcock before it could be stopped. The massa had picked that bird knowing how smart, aggressive, and deep game it was. For just a split second, Chicken George seemed again to hear an outraged Matilda. "You's crazier even than massa. Worst can happen to him is endin' up just a po' cracker again, but you's gambling yo' whole family's freedom on some chicken." Then the three judges stepped out, positioning themselves evenly around the cockpit, the referee poised as if he stood on eggs. An atmosphere seemed to be hovering that everyone there knew they were about to witness something to talk about for the rest of their days. Chicken George saw his massa and the Englishman holding down their straining birds, both of their faces raised to watch the referee's lips. Pit. The silvery blue and dark buff birds blurred toward each other, crashing violently and bouncing backward, landing on their feet. Both were instantly again in the air, tearing to reach each other's vitals. Beaks snapping, spurs flashing, were moving at a blinding speed, attacking with ferocity that Chicken George had seldom seen equaled by any two birds in a cockpit. Suddenly the Englishman's silvery blue was hit. The massa's bird had sunk a spur deeply into one of its wing bones. They fell off balance. both struggling to loosen the stuck spur while pecking viciously at each other's heads. "Handle! 30 seconds!" The referee's shout was barely uttered before both the Englishman and Massalia sprang in, the spur freed. Both men licked their birds' disarrayed head feathers and to smoothness again, then set them back down on their starting lines, this time holding them by the tails. "Get ready. Pit." Again, the cocks met evenly high in midair, both sets of spurs seeking a lethal strike, but failing to do so before they dropped back to the ground. The Massa's bird dashed, trying to knock its enemy off balance, but the English bird feinted brilliantly sidewise, drawing the crowd's gasps as the Massa's bird lunged harmlessly past at full force. Before he whirled about, the English bird was upon him. They rolled furiously on the ground, then regained their feet, battling furiously beak to beak, parting, beating at each other, with powerful wing blows above a flurry of slashing legs. Again they took to the air, dropping back again, ground fighting with new fury. A cry rose. The English bird had drawn blood. A spreading, darkening area showed on the breast of the Massa's bird, but he violently buffeted his enemy with wing blows until it stumbled and he sprang above it for a kill. But again the English bird brilliantly crouched, dodged, escaped. Chicken George had never witnessed such incredibly swift reflexes, but the Massa's bird now whirled forcefully enough to knock the English bird onto its back. He hit it twice in the chest, drawing blood, but the English bird managed to flap into the air and came down, striking the Massa's bird in the neck. Chicken George had quit breathing as the bleeding birds sparred, circling, heads low, each seeking an opening. In a sudden blinding flurry, the English bird was overpowering the Massa's bird, battering with its wings, its striking spurs drawing more blood. Then, incredibly, the Massa's bird burst into the air, and as it came down, sinking a spur into the English bird's heart, it collapsed in a feathery heap, its beak gushing blood. It came so swiftly that a second or so seemed to pass before the huge din rose. Screaming, red-faced men were springing up and down. "Tom! Tom! He done it!" Chicken George, beyond happiness, saw them mobbing the Massa, pounding his back, pumping his hand. "Tom Leah! Tom Leah! Tom Leah!" "We's gonna be free," Chicken George kept thinking. The actuality of soon telling his family seemed unbelievable, inconceivable. He glimpsed the Englishman with his jaw set in a way that made one think of a bulldog. "Mr. Leah!" Probably nothing else could have so quickly quieted the crowd. The Englishman was walking. He stopped about 3 yards distant from the Massa. He said, "Your bird fought brilliantly. Either one could have won it. They were the most perfectly matched pair I've ever seen. I'm told you're a kind of sportsman who might care to let your winnings ride on another contest between birds of ours." Massalia stood there, his face blanched. For seconds, cooped gamecocks' cluckings and crowings were the only sounds heard as thronged men tried to comprehend the potential of 2 gamecocks battling with $80,000 at stake, winner take all. Heads had swiveled toward Massalia. He seemed bewildered, uncertain. For one split second, his glance brushed Chicken George, working feverishly on the injured bird. Chicken George was as startled as others to hear his own voice. "Yo birds whoop anything with feathers, Massa." The sea of white faces swiveled toward him. "I've heard that your faithful is among the best trainers, but I wouldn't rely too much on his advice. I also have other very good birds." The words had come as if the rich Englishman regarded his previous loss about as he might have a game of marbles, as if he were taunting Massalia. Then Massalia sounded elaborately formal. "Yes, sir, as you propose, I'll take pleasure in letting the sum ride on another fight." The next several minutes of preparatory activities passed almost as a blur for Chicken George. Not a sound came from the surrounding crowd. There had never been anything like this. All of Chicken George's instincts approved when Massalia indicated with a forefinger the coop containing the bird that Chicken George had previously given a nickname. "De hawk, yassa," he breathed, knowing precisely that bird's tendency for seizing and holding an enemy with its beak while slashing with its spurs. It would be the countermeasure for birds trained to feint expertly, as the previous contest had suggested was characteristic within the Englishman's flock. Cradling the hawk in his arm, Massalia went out to where the Englishman held a solid dark gray bird. The birds weighed in at 6 pounds even. When "pit" came, bringing the anticipated rushing impact, somehow instead of either bird taking to the air, they exchanged furious wing blows, and Chicken George could hear the hawk's beak snapping after a proper hold, when somehow amid mutual buffeting an English spur struck in savagely. The Mass's bird stumbled, and its head dropped limply for an instant before it collapsed, its opened mouth streaming blood. "Oh Lord, oh Lord, oh Lord," Chicken George went bolting, knocking aside men in his lunge into the circular cockpit, bellowing like a baby, scooping up the obviously mortally wounded hawk. He sucked clotting blood from its beak as it weakly fluttered, dying in his hands. He struggled to his feet with the nearest men drawing back from his bawling anguish as he stumbled back through the crowd and toward the wagon cradling the dead bird. Back about the pit a gathering of planters were wildly backslapping and congratulating the Englishman and Massa Jewett. All of their backs were turned to the stricken, solitary figure of Massalia, who stood rooted, staring down with a glazed look at the bloodstains in the cockpit. Turning finally, Sir C. Eric Russell walked over to where Massalia was, and Massalia slowly raised his eyes. "What did you say?" he mumbled. "I said, sir, it just wasn't your lucky day." Massalia managed a trace of a smile. Sir C. Eric Russell said, "Concerning the wager, of course, no one cares about such sums in his pocket. Why don't we settle up tomorrow? Say, sometime in the afternoon." He paused. "After the tea hour, at Mr. Jewett's home." Numbly, Massalia nodded, "Yes, sir." The trip home took 2 hours. Neither the Massa nor Chicken George spoke a word. It was the longest ride Chicken George had ever taken, but it had not been long enough as the wagon pulled into the driveway. When Massalia returned from Massa Jewett's during the next day's dusk, he found Chicken George mixing meal for the cockerels in the supply hut, where he had spent most of the hours since Matilda's screams, wails, and shouting during the previous night had finally driven him from their cabin. "George," the Massa said, "I got something hard to tell you." He paused, groping for words. "Don't know how to say it hardly, but you already know I ain't had nowhere near the money folks thinks I did. Fact is, 'cept for a few thousand, about all I own is the house, this land, and you few." "He's going to sell us," George sensed. "Trouble is," the Massa went on, "even all that ain't but round half what I owe that goddamned son of a bitch. But he's offered me a break." The Massa hesitated again. "You heard him say what he'd heard about you, and he said today he could see how good you train and both the birds fought." The Massa took a deep breath. George held his. "Well, seems like he needs to replace a trainer he lost over in England a while back, and he thinks bringing back a trainer would be fun." The Massa couldn't look into George's disbelieving eyes and became more abrupt. "Not to drag out this mess. He'll call us square for all I've got in cash, a first and second mortgage on the house, and using you over in England long enough to train somebody else. He says no more in a couple of years." The Massa forced himself to look at Chicken George in the face. "Can't tell you how bad I feel about this, George. I ain't got no choice. He's letting me off light. If I don't do it, I'm ruined. Everything I ever worked for." George couldn't find words. What could he say? After all, he was the Massa's slave. "Now, I know you're wiped out too, and I mean to make it up to you. So I pledge you my word right here and now while you're gone I'll take care of your woman and young'uns, and the day you get home, Massalia paused, sliding a hand into his pocket, withdrawing it and holding a folded paper that he unfolded and thrust before Chicken George. Know what this is? Sat down and wrote it out last night. You're looking right at your legal freedom paper, boy. I'm going to keep it in my strong box to hand you the day you come back. But after momentarily staring at the mysterious writing that covered most of the square, white sheet of paper, Chicken George continued struggling to control his fury. "Massa," he said quietly, "I was gonna buy us all free. Now all I had gone. And you sendin' me off 'cross the water somewheres way from my wife and chillins besides. How come you can't lease free dem now, den me when I gets back?" Massa Leah's eyes narrowed. "I don't need you tellin' me what to do, boy. Ain't my fault you lost that money. I'm offerin' to do too much for you anyhow. That's the trouble with—" "You better be careful of your mouth." The Mass's face was reddening. "If it wasn't for you bein' all your life here, I'd just go ahead and sell your ass." George looked at him, then shook his head. "If all my life mean anything to you, Massa, how come you's just messin' it up mo'?" The Mass's face set into hardness. "Pack whatever you intend to take with you. You leave for England Saturday."